Welcome to the Kathy Moran podcast. Here you will find a series of in-depth conversations with the world's best nature photographers, filmmakers, conservationists, editors, writers, and publishers. You will get an insight into the lives of creative professionals and industry experts, what goes on in their minds, how they approach their work, and how they make it pay. The podcast also looks at the role that photography and filmmaking plays in helping to raise awareness about the global plight of species. And despite the depressing statistics, we look for solutions at what we can all do to contribute to conservation. All my guests give up their precious time and are incredibly generous of spirit. So this is my chance to share these conversations with you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Okay, so it's been a long time since my interview with Susie, and well, ever since then, really, I've had my head in Foxbook world, really for the past 6 months and more, and we are just coming out of the other side of that. We're going to launch our book at the Natural History Museum on the 25th of April, which we're all super excited about. And if you would like, you could be part of this event. You can watch the live stream. Yes, we're going to be live streamed on the Natural History Museum's YouTube channel. And to get access, you can make a small donation to the museum's Urban Nature Project. That's the hook. We're teaming up with this ambitious project that the museum have embarked on. It's already begun. They're transforming the grounds around the museum, lots of outreach work and partnerships with other museums around the country, getting people to engage with nature on their doorsteps, which has very much been part of my mission over the past 10 years. And you can find out more by visiting nhm.ac.uk and search for the Urban Nature Project. I'm pleased to say I'm back today with my fabulous guest, Kathy Moran, who recently retired from National Geographic as the Deputy Director of Photography, and an incredible 40-year career editing over 350 stories for the magazine. We talk about the early days at Nat Geo, her career breaks, the role of a photo editor, and the change in style of photo storytelling. And we also discuss life after the magazine with her new venture, Moran Griffin, her husband David. You can find out more about this by heading over to the podcast page on my website and visit Kathy's page for links to this and much more. Without further ado, here's Kathy. Kathy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and taking the time after a daylight savings error a week ago, which was my fault. We're doing this again. You're on the East Coast, right? Whereabouts do you live?
Yes, we're right outside of Washington, D.C., so just across the river in Arlington, Virginia.
And you've been there. Have you been there for as long as you've worked for National Geographic?
I've been in Arlington for 22 years. David and I got married, and he said it must be love because I left the city to come to the suburbs.
Wow. And I say worked at National Geographic because you've recently retired, and that's quite a big deal. How are you feeling? How are you coping in the weeks that have passed since?
It was a huge decision. I was with the Geographic for 40 years, and really 40 and a half when I left at the end of December. So, it was an amazing, I hate to think of it this way, it was an amazing 4 decades. And, but the last few weeks, I've been surprisingly busy. I was a participant in the Exposure Photo Festival in Sharjah, the UAE, and David and I have started doing work together. We have a few books that he's designing on photo editing. So it's been surprisingly busy these last few weeks.
I hear that a lot about people that retire. And then also, I was thinking about how different people react to retiring, especially when you've been in a business for such a long time. Like, my own mum, for example, she was a teacher at the same school for 25 years, and she worked her way up to becoming the head teacher, and she was the head teacher for 8 years. And when she retired, she kind of struggled with it because her identity was, the head teacher. Like, you're always in demand, always people needing things from you. and then to suddenly go from that to actually quite, in the first few weeks not being so in demand. I think, some people jump straight into it and just get stuck into things, and other people find time to find a new identity. But I guess, like you say, you've been really busy, perhaps you haven't had time to discover what that is yet.
It's the last few years at the National Geographic, I was actually the deputy director of photography, and so I had stepped away from photo editing stories, and it was more management and working with my colleagues on their projects. So I think the thing that was really nice was to find myself back on the editing side, and that's really been enjoyable, because there's just there's nothing like working with a photographer and digging into it and seeing that narrative come together. But I think the big surprise for me, especially after the last few years of working remotely, and Zoom was such a I mean, it's been a godsend, but it's a time suck. And it wasn't unusual for all of us to be solidly at our desk for 10 hours a day, just zooming nonstop. And there would the sense of sort of, I think, time constraint in 9 to 5 went away, because it was so easy to just stay connected. And what's been the nice surprise these last few weeks is realizing that it's an hour or so in the middle of the day, and I find myself reading a book or taking a walk, or the first few times I felt guilty. It was like playing hooky. But it's an interesting concept after all of these years of working in an office to I think have that sense of control over your own schedule again. I haven't had it in such a long time, that I think that's been the thing that's been most interesting to come to terms with. That, oh yeah, I can control how the day goes. So that's been fun.
Yeah, your muscle memory is telling you should be working really hard doing those 10-hour days, but actually, yeah, you do have that little bit more time to do it now. And actually, I didn't realize I knew it was over 30 years. I didn't realize it was over 40 years you were there. So can you go back for us right to the beginning and tell us how you got started there? And did you have an interest in photography before you worked there? Was that your first job at National Geographic, looking at photos?
Oh, this is like, going into the Middle Ages. Back to the beginning of time. When I went to school, I went for journalism with the idea that I would write. I'd get a job with newspapers, whatever course that might take. And when I first graduated, I was actually quite shy, and I don't know what made me think I was going to be this hard charging reporter. And my first job, I taught high school history, and really loved it, but they were just temporary jobs. But someone would be on maternity leave or sick leave or whatever, and I would go in for these sort of long-term commitments to different schools. And I was also on weekends basically an assistant to a photographer working for the local newspaper. And he got his first assignment at National Geographic while I was assisting him. And so, off he went. And when he came back, he said, I understand that they're hiring, and, happy to put in a good word for you. And I thought, well, why not? I've got nothing to lose. And one of the things that appealed to me about the Geographic was I knew that they had a really robust research staff who did, you couldn't put so much as a vowel in the magazine without someone, just researching it to up one side and down the other. And I thought that sounded like something I would really enjoy. So I reached out, got an interview, I went down, and it turned out that they weren't hiring. They were in the midst of a hiring freeze. But they'd very, very, kindly, went through the process of the interview. And when it was all over, I just looked at the recruiter had said, well, if I learn how to type, would you hire me? And he said, he was just great. He started laughing and he said, if you learn how to type, I will give you a job. So I immediately signed up for this, accelerated typing and shorthand course. And I was walking through the doors 3 months later. As at that time, I mean, this is, again, we're talking years and years ago. They had an internal secretarial service, was what they called it. And if someone's assistant was on vacation or sick leave or whatever, you would go fill in. And it turned out to be the perfect way into an organization because you floated throughout the entire society. And, I went in thinking, well, I want to work in the research department, but by the time I landed, in the photo editing department, it took like a nanosecond to go, oh, are you kidding? This is what this place is all about. It's the photography. And so it was a fantastic introduction to the organization, and it changed my direction in a matter of weeks because I fell in love with the photo editors and the photographers and that side of the storytelling. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I was very lucky at the organization, and that most of those sort of entry level jobs, they had about a 2-year lifespan, and you would have really picked up everything you needed to know in that amount of time. And then, it was either something you were happy to do, or it was time to move on. And every time I felt that I've taken this as far as I can go, I need to look elsewhere, something would open up inside. So I had a number of jobs within the organization before I finally landed on the magazine as a photo editor. But I just felt so lucky that I never had to leave, that the opportunity kept presenting within the society so that I could keep growing and challenging myself.
Yeah, that's amazing. If you talk about learning throughout this 2-year period, what you needed to learn for that part of the job, obviously it says something about the society that you stayed there for 40 years. I guess it kept being refreshed, and of course over the years, you build all these great relationships. I'm sure not just with colleagues, but all the photographers that you work with. I mean, that sounds like such a great journey to go on. And I was curious about your answer to that question because I think often we perhaps might look at other photographers or people at National Geographic, senior editors, and think, they had this dream of sitting out there in the wilderness thinking, I'm going to work for National Geographic one day. But actually it was something really boring, like learning how to type to get you in there.
I will say this, I never regretted learning to type. I mean, it's a great skill, but the thing that I still carry with me and use constantly is that shorthand. I mean, the thing that you never would imagine you'd have to learn or that you would use. And I still do everything. All of my notes are in shorthand. And sometimes I forget, someone else may need to see them and they're just absolutely indecipherable.
Yeah, that's, it's going to be one of my questions later was like, what what does it take to become a journalist, a photographer, or an editor working at National Geographic? And yeah, learn to type. I mean, maybe those skills are not so required now. Was National Geographic set up for that kind of growth? I mean, what were the systems that were in place where you learnt the typical working day of a photo editor? Was there training that you did when you were younger at the society, or did it happen organically?
For me, it was a very organic process. And the two photo editors that I worked for, Declan Hahn and John Schneeberger, were incredible mentors and great friends. So they, I was always very welcome, to sit in and watch the process when they were working with photographers and, had stories and layout, or whatever phase of production any of their projects were in. So that was huge. But so much of it really was just gaining experience and moving through the organization. When I was their coordinator for about 18 months, and then moved into a job called film review. And back then everything was film, and so the photographers would be in the field for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time, and they were shipping the film back to Washington for processing. So months could go by between the time they actually made an image before they ever saw the photograph. I mean, we'd seen it all, but they hadn't seen anything. And so what would happen in film review was this recording of everything as it came in, getting it ready to ship out to Kodak for processing, because they were the only ones who could do it, then bringing it back in and getting everything organized for the photo editors, but in the process giving a report to the photographers in the field. This is working, that's not working, ooh, that film got x-rayed, or whatever it might be, to sort of keep them going, both technically and I'd even say emotionally, because they were just working in the dark. Back then they didn't, we didn't even have color Xerox machines at that point. There was very little that you could do, other than say to them, this is looking good, that didn't work, try this again, blah 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 blah. So we were sort of that first line of communication with the photographer in the field, because again, depending on how busy the editor was, it might take them a few more weeks before they got through a shipment. So I think that for me was really when editing skills were developed, and that was working much more closely with the photographers than with the photo editors. But then I think the thing that really made everything possible for me was that in 1888, I was not there in 1888. In 1988, when the society had their centennial, up until that point, they'd never had their own communications department. And they realized that this was going to be a big deal for the organization to be turning 100. So they put together the communications team, and they needed a photo editor. So that was my first photo editor title. I joined that team and did that for 2 years. And that was trial by fire, because in essence, it was 3 divisions that came together into one. And so I was responsible for being the photo editor for these 3 very, very different teams. And in close communication with the magazine at all times, because, in essence, the centennial was a celebration of the magazine itself.
And so this job you had, was this like photo editing across the board, or this wasn't at this time specialist natural history work?
No, this was just anything and everything. Every request that came in from other media companies wanting to do stories on the centennial. There was an internal news service that was, they were providing stories for syndication worldwide. They all had to have images. There were internal newsletters that were being created on a monthly basis. All those stories had to, have photos made and edited and, put into production. So it was really, we were sort of a clearinghouse for everything that was happening during that centennial year. And of course it continued beyond, obviously, but that was an intense year. And I think even though the photo editors knew me through the work in film review, being able to work that much more closely with them through the centennial year, I learned from them. They were aware of what I was doing and how I was growing. So when the magazine started, what we call the front matter, but when you flip through the magazine now, they're all those sort of wonderful, very eclectic, small stories in the front of the magazine before you hit the feature well. Well, that was really new, like in 89, 90. And again, they realized that, it was a full-time job, and they needed a photo editor who was dedicated to just working on those stories. So I was like, oh, pick me, pick me. And they did. So I was really, once again, very lucky at that moment where I thought, um, I've done the comms work, as this is as much as I want of that kind of editing, and I really wanted to get back into something that felt fully editorial. And so I was able to rejoin the magazine. And what I realized at that time, there was an amazing woman named Mary Smith. She was a photo editor, but she was the liaison between the magazine and what was called the Committee for Research and Exploration. And that committee, they were the scientists who would come together several times a year and review all of the grant proposals. In essence, they were the team who approved funding for Jane Goodall and the Leakeys, and Diane Fossey, and Jacques Cousteau, and all those amazing explorers who were at that point synonymous with the Geographic. And Mary was the person who worked with all of them. And Mary was retiring, and Mary was such a force that when she was leaving, she didn't just like go to the head of the department and say, well, here are the stories that are still in production. Mary went around and gave away her stories to the editor that she felt would be best suited to bring it over the finish line. And Mary came to me at just this moment when Nick Nichols and Mike Fay were finishing up their very first story together on the Adobe National Park. And Mary said, I want you to do this. I was like, oh, okay, I'll do it. She threw a few other, little ones at me, but this was at that moment in the magazine's history, this was one of the most time and budget intensive stories they'd ever done, just by the nature of working in the Congo. And I'll never forget Nick Nichols when he came back to the office and he realized that Mary had given me this story, and he walked into my office and he's like, oh, damn, you're just a baby. Like, how's this gonna work? And I said, well, trust me, it's gonna work. And that was the first story that Nick and I did together, and that was my first really big thing with the magazine. And I've always felt that it was such an act of faith and generosity on Mary's part to trust me with
That's awesome. Story. And this was the story that resulted in quite significant change in the Congo, right, in terms of national parks.
No, that the
was that the Gabon?
That was the mega transect.
Yes.
Yeah. So
this was what year are we talking with this with the Michael?
This would have been sort of early 90s. And it was Nick and Mike's first story together, and they both. It was just an intense challenge for the photography, for the text, and I think it was Mike Fay's first experience with the kind of intensity that a National Geographic team brings into the field. So I think they all walked away from that story and swore they've never talked to each other or ever worked together again. And then years later, Nick and Mike were at a conference together, and as literally, Nick's cab pulled up to the hotel, and Mike had been waiting, and he just, came running down the steps as Nick is getting out of the cab, and he's like, I got a story, I have an idea, you have to do this project with me. And that was the mega transect, which took years of planning actually to bring to fruition. And then of course, I think Mike was in the field, something like 444 days. He never
Wow.
left the field. The writer David Quammen and of course Nick, came and went throughout the course of the mega transect, but Mike never stopped walking,
That,
starting in
that's
Congo and then into Gabon to the coast. And of course, we ran 3 stories, well, along the way, and they ultimately, when Mike met with then President Omar Bongo of Gabon, he was in New York for the opening of the United Nations. Mike had a meeting with him in a New York hotel room, and he showed him Nick's photos. And President Bongo said, I never knew this was in my own country, this beauty,
yeah.
this wildlife. And he went back and mandated the creation of the national park system.
Yeah, that's incredible, and really does show the power of photography. I've watched a few interviews with you, Kathy, and I laughed at one of them when you said your job is boring. It's the photographers that are out there that have the exciting job, but you have had this amazing kind of privileged position of being able to see all this content really before anyone does, and of course it's a joy, but I can imagine a stress and a challenge to select from thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of images, a handful that are going to tell the story in the best way. And I'm sure you approach each story differently, but maybe talk a little bit about that process and the mindset that you have to get into when it comes to photo editing, particularly a big story like that.
Well, at that point, Nick and I had done at least a half dozen other stories together, and so we had a pretty good sense of how to work together. And I've always felt that, I mean, for me, editing is a very personal process, and I try to think about who the photographer is and what their approach to work is. And when I'm editing, sometimes, especially with Nick, it was like I was setting the stage for that conversation that we would have when he was back from the field, and we would actually be editing together. Because sometimes it's not just about pulling the best frame. For me, often it's about pulling a frame to say, I know what you were thinking. I know what you were trying to do here. It might not have worked, but we're going to talk about this later, because it clearly, this situation, this moment mattered to you. And I'm not just going to blow past it because it didn't work out. We will talk about what worked, what didn't work. Um, so for me, it's always been a very very personal, and trying to, again, always take into account that everyone works differently. So you just can't apply a one size fits all approach to editing. So that's one thing I always really try very hard to keep in mind. And I,
Yeah.
I think as an editor, one of the biggest challenges is that you're a member of a story team. It's the photographer, it's the writer, it's the text editor. When you're all coming together at various points and talking about the story, and what you're finding along the way and how it's evolving, because they all evolve. It's one thing to say we're going to go do X, Y, and Z, but when you get into the field, things change all the time. But how you stay true to being a member of that team and supporting the photographer and what they want to be doing, but also remembering that you have a responsibility to the editor and to the readers, and that there will always come a point when you're putting that story together where you have to stop and you have to step back and say what's best for the story, what's best for the editor, what's best for the, 'cause ultimately the editor is your client. It's at the end of the day, it's not about making us happy. It's about making the editor happy and the reader happy. So, there are always those moments where the photographer's favorite images might not make it. And they might not make it simply because they don't serve the story. So
Yeah.
you're always like trying to support the photographer, support the story, ensure that the narrative is coming together, but always bearing in mind that you're sort of a Jekyll and Hyde when it comes to that loyalty, and ultimately making sure that what winds up on the pages is what really serves the story and the audience.
Kathy, we have limited time. We already talked a bit about the big change in '88 with the approach to photo storytelling at the magazine. And I was curious to learn whether there was a bigger change in your 40-year career at the magazine. We've talked about all the issues of sending over hundreds of rolls of film and photographers not seeing their work or getting feedback on their work for weeks and weeks. So do you think the digital revolution was the biggest change during your 40-year career at the magazine?
Well, I mean, I think one thing, when certainly in the early days of digital, I think a lot of photo editors thought, well, does this make us obsolete? The photographer can see what they're doing in that moment, and what's the role here. But what I really felt happened was that it created a much more collaborative dynamic, because you could actually be communicating with each other in that moment, and in real time be saying to someone, oh, perfect, move on, you've got it, don't spend any more time on this, we have it, move on to that. Or, oh, that's not working, is it? And then problem solve together. So it actually, I think, changed the relationship in a really positive way in most situations. But I think changes along the way, certainly as the magazine evolved, I think different approaches to storytelling across the board came together. I think it's fair to say, in the 70s, even into the 80s, there was sort of a blanket approach to the storytelling. Oh, let's go do, Texas. Off someone would go and they'd photograph Texas. Now it would be, well, what about Texas? What about London? What about, any particular topic? Why are we doing this? And so I think that, over the last, certainly 20 years, that the storytelling has become much more, it's more fine-tuned. And, and I think it's more, I think it's just more interesting in both in terms of the writing and the photography, because it's just it's streamlined. We're actually telling a story. This is what you should know about something. This is what we're revealing. It's not just Texas. So I just think that we're doing much more interesting storytelling now.
Yeah.
Certainly when it comes to the natural history. Again, when I started, it would be, well, go do lions, go do elephants, go do, well, what about them? Other than, the life cycle, okay, you've got cubs, you've got predation, you've got pride behavior. What else? And that's not to say that there weren't amazing photographs that were being made, but again, what did the story add up to? And we made, when Chris Johns became editor of the magazine, we made a very conscious decision to really step back and look at the natural history stories that we were telling, and realizing that we had to put all of this into context. Again, I always come back to Nick because we did so much work together. But when Nick and I proposed the Serengeti lion, we were very clear in our intent in that we could not just focus on the lions, that we were going to have to also take a look at what does it mean to live with a predator, what's happening in terms of habitat encroachment, or if you're a community and you've had lions predating on your livestock, what are the solutions? All of those other things that give the full picture, that lions are not living in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Lions are living surrounded by humans, the very people who have to coexist with a predator. And that approach to um, storytelling, natural history stories, was really new for the magazine, and I think it was a fundamental change. It was a change that we had to make, and Chris really embraced it and believed in it.
Yeah, so it sounded like it was a conscious decision, because that's something that I've lived through that time of photography being kind of an elite subject with those with the biggest budgets and all the roles of film, to now everyone's a nature photographer. But that's a great thing. People are out there engaging with nature with their cameras, so telling stories about conservation and what you can do with your images, rather than just showing like another beautiful picture of a pride of lions or whatever. I'm not knocking it, but it seems like, and for good reason, that's the direction that it's taken and been going for a long time. And I think one of the questions for me was National Geographic with the reach, and certainly with the power from the early 90s with the mega transect, and a government setting up national parks as a result of a story is pretty impactful. And if you look at since that time, biodiversity crisis is got worse. We're losing things always at an alarming rate. I guess in a way the responsibility that the magazine has of trying to preserve and protect, and how do you reconcile that over all these years? It's like the technology is improving, the writing's improving, the reach now with social media is improving, but biodiversity, habitat loss, climate change, all of these sort of negativities surrounding it, how does the magazine reconcile that?
Well, I think all that the magazine can do is continue to produce the kinds of stories that people need to be aware of. I do think, you know, my my former colleague Whitney Johnson, who's the director of photography, we used to laugh about the unintended silver consequence of COVID, was that it it gave us the opportunity, it made us look actually to work with local photographers. And I think that that change in working with people in country might also be a way in which we there's greater outreach, because now it's someone who lives in Kenya, or India, or wherever the story might take place. It's not someone who's going and doing the story and then leaving. Now you have someone who lives there, who's done the story, who's made the photographs, and who maybe in an odd way has an even greater potential for outreach at a local level, so that it's not just necessarily reaching this particular audience. Maybe now a much broader audience is engaging with the work. So that would be one hope. And I also think that the magazine, it's not just about what comes out every month. It's about
Sure.
what that team is producing, on a daily basis, on the digital platform, which also, has enormous reach. And so you just really, I don't think it's about changing the stories that we're doing. It's about, doing whatever you can to reach more and more people.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. It's getting the story out there. Doing the story that's happening.
Yeah, sure. It's frightening, isn't it, when you think about the reach is huge, but almost, as you're saying, it's not big enough. You have to reach so many more people to inspire and inform and hopefully enact positive change. So yeah, you're right. It's you have to continue.
Yeah, it inspire, Matt. I mean, I think that's really inform and inspire, because and it is about, you've got to find the balance. I mean, you don't want people to think that it's hopeless. Otherwise, you've accomplished nothing. People are just going to turn away. But if you can find that balance, and get people engaged with, making necessary changes in their own lives, or, you know, engaging with government to make changes that should happen. I mean, that's when you see, really powerful photography at work.
Yeah, and very satisfying results. I'm going to have to ask you this because a lot of my audience will be wondering, what it takes to become a photographer, whether you're published once or in many of the photographers that you've worked with multiple times. What would you say that makes the difference between becoming a photographer that will work with National Geographic and one that doesn't?
Oh, wow. The magic serum. Um, I think it's two things. First of all, we all have a camera in our hands these days with our phones, and there are a lot of people out there who can make, really engaging one-off images. But, I think that there's a difference between photographing and seeing. And I think, there are photographers who just have a very distinctive approach to how they photograph, how they see, that makes that work stand out. And I think, although, look, I do believe that you can tell a powerful story in a single image. At the Geographic, what really matters is being able to create, what we call visual narrative. And how do you, understanding how you build that visual narrative so that you can sustain, across, multiple pages. And that, I think learning narrative, whether it's in a single frame or sustained, is something that you have to learn. It takes time, and it takes, I think I always say to photographers, don't first of all, you're not a wildlife photographer, you are a photographer. If you are telling stories, you ought to be able to tell a story wherever you are. And the way that you get good at it is going out and photographing every single day. You don't wait for that once a year trip that you've saved up for to go back to Africa. You've got to find it. I mean, which is why I love your work so much. You're out every day doing a really great story on urban foxes, and they're there, and you can go out and you can grow as a photographer and storyteller every single day. And I think that's the thing that anyone starting out really needs to think about. You have to grow. You have to get better as you would with any profession. And so that means you've got to have that camera with you all the time. You've got to be photographing, you have to be seeing, you have to be thinking, and you have to find those stories that are close to home and challenge yourself with them. Look, a squirrel, putting together a narrative on a squirrel is just as challenging as putting together a narrative on a giraffe. But in doing that, you're going to be a better photographer when the opportunity presents, to go be on safari or do whatever it is, the story you want to tell.
Yeah, yeah, that's really the narrative, and I think you, like you said, the pandemic put that into sharp focus of sticking with subjects close to home. Kathy, I know you've got a dash. I want to ask you one more quick question and just an opportunity as well for you to tell us a little bit about the project you set up with your husband David, and people might be interested in hearing about that and learning a bit more. We can also put links and everything else in the notes on your page.
Oh, thanks.
So yeah, let us know a bit about, other than having time to read books, which I think you probably earned over 40 years. You are also straight into a new business. You have a nice website. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, David and I are sort of a National Geographic cliche, two people who, met there and, fell in love and got married. David was a designer. I mean, he had a long career at the Geographic as well. He was a designer for the magazine and then the book division, and then came back as the director of photography at one point. But the last few years, he's had his own design business and primarily doing books. And we always loved working together, but once he left the Geographic, we just didn't have the opportunity. And so when I retired, we to our delight, we had a few people reach out and ask us to take on projects with them, David designing, me editing book projects. So that's been a lot of fun. That's and again, sort of getting back into the rhythm of working together has been terrific. And also it's, as I said, I'm sort of surprised. There's people reach out, they ask for portfolio reviews, they want feedback on this, or could you give me a quick opinion on an edit. And I actually love that, because in so many ways, look, I've had an amazing career, but my career was made possible through the incredible work of all the photographers that I was lucky enough to work with. And now, if someone calls me and says, would you look something over, I sort of feel like, yeah, it's time to give back. You guys gave it all to me, and I'm more than happy to give it back to you. So it's nice to be able to spend time with former colleagues and do things with them, and also with groups like the International League of Conservation Photographers, and you know they ask for help doing reviews and things, and I just love that. I love actually having the time to be able to say to someone, yeah, I've got an hour free on Saturday morning. Let's look at that portfolio before you submit it to the New York Times, or let's
Sure.
so that's been great. But the process of working with David again, it's sort of it's back to roots, when he was a designer and I was a photo editor and we were doing stories together. Now we've just supersized and we're doing books. So
That's great. That's great. But yeah, I guess be careful, because people will, you find your email address and you'll be inundated. Oh, can you do my portfolio review? Oh, I've got this book idea. So it'll be like right back, being back at the National Geographic, inundated with emails.
well, those are great emails. Editing is just it's a joy. It's a joy. That was always the best part of the job.
Sounds like a great place to end it, Kathy. And thank you so much for your time. Really lovely to speak to you, and I'm sure the listeners are going to get a great deal of insight and hear behind the scenes and what's going on, and also your journey. And congratulations as well. That's no mean feat, spending 40 years there. And yeah, I hope you continue to give yourself some time off.
Oh, thank you, and
as well.
Congratulations to you and Neil and Andy on the book. I can't wait to see it.
That's very exciting. Yeah, we've just got the folded and gathered sheets back this week. So yeah, you get these books back in stages. You see them on press, and now the next time I see it will be bound up, and yeah, we can't wait to get that going. And yeah, well, thank you for contributing as well, and you should have your copy in May.
Well, every time I see a fox go through the yard, I think of you guys. So anyway, it's nice
Good stuff.
talking to you.
Yeah, lovely talking to you. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Wow, 40 years. It took a while for me to get Kathy on the podcast. And in fact, I think this podcast would only have happened once Kathy had retired. But I really appreciate her generosity and openness to share all those great stories. Again, if you'd like to find out more about Kathy's new venture with her husband, David Moran Griffin, you can visit that, morangriffin.com, or just head over to Kathy's page on my site and there'll be some direct links there. Now, we just have 2 weeks left before our book goes on general sale. You can save a few pounds by pre-ordering at foxbook.shop, and that price will go up on the 3rd of May when the book comes out. Sad to say, everything's going up. We had to up the price of our book as a result, but it's still good value for money at £35. I've had it in my hands for a couple of weeks now, and it feels like a £35 book, if I don't say so myself. So thanks again to everyone who backed our Kickstarter campaign. What a journey it's been. We're so close, and we cannot wait to get the book out there. Hope you enjoyed that. Won't be too long before my next guest, who's already booked in next month, and we will get these rolling now, hopefully a little bit more regularly. But thanks again for listening.